Welcome to Denham's Trade Notes, a series that highlights topical trade issues with our experts around the world. I'm Stephenson, the Senior Associate in the Denham's Toronto office, and today I'm here with Mike Zolandz, the Chair of the U.S. Federal Regulatory and Compliance Practice and the Managing Partner of the Washington, D.C. office. Hi, Mike.
Hey there, Sean. How are you?
Good. Mike, let's talk export controls. Just before the holiday break, the U.S. administration announced the addition of 77 entities to the entity list under the Export Administration Regulation. These included mainly Chinese entities, some of China's top chip makers and drone manufacturers. Can you give us the background on that announcement and the current status?
Sure. So this is really one piece of what we've seen out of the Trump administration, but really within the U.S. government writ large, is a concern over Chinese access to U.S. sensitive and controlled technologies. So we've seen changes to inbound foreign direct investment rules in the United States with a heavy emphasis on protecting emerging growth technologies and emerging growth industries in the U.S. We've seen, as everyone is aware, an acceleration in tariffs and an acceleration in targeting of Chinese inbound investments and inbound imports. And this is another piece of the puzzle. It comes from a concern over cyber hacking. It comes from a concern over some very high profile arrests in 2020 of trade secret theft. And it comes from a concern that from a institutional perspective, that there's a real competition brewing between the US and China over emerging technology. This most recent inclusion of 77 entities that you mentioned has several components. Some are paramilitary or alleged paramilitary organizations, so a direct concern that the companies at issue are supplying US origin technology to the Chinese military. There's another element that is, more broadly speaking, trade competition, so concern over the speed with which China has accelerated its deployment of 5G throughout the world, and a desire by the US to remain competitive there. And then there's another component, which is also a sort of human rights type of concern, focused on some of these companies' activities in the Xinjiang province and allegations that have been documented in the media of forced labor camps in Xinjiang, and a concern that this type of conduct by the Chinese government is one that needs to be monitored and discouraged from a US investment perspective. One other important context is that these focuses on technology also applied more recently in 2020 to US government regulations around the use of Chinese technology in applications where there's government contracts in the US. So this is really a broad spectrum type of focus across multiple agencies of the US government: the Treasury Department, State Department, Commerce Department, and Customs and Border Protection, all focused on the ways in which Chinese technology moves throughout the world, and also the ways in which US technology is permitted to be exported when there's a potential for a Chinese end user to be in the picture.
So what does this mean specifically for US businesses? And also, does this have any implications for non-US businesses, if you're a Canadian business or an EU business or otherwise?
Sure. So U.S. export controls, like many other things that have a U.S. law component, tend to be fairly expansive. So for a U.S. business, really it means updating your compliance software, making sure that your current screening lists and screening protocols are up to date, checking your supply chain to see where and when U.S. origin technology is being exported. The entity list specifically is really a complete prohibition. It really covers virtually every type of US origin item to those entities from a restriction perspective. So it's not a licensing scenario, it's actually a flat prohibition. So for US businesses, it's making sure that your compliance programs are updated and ready to handle that new set of requirements. For non-US businesses, it's really a supply chain issue. You need to understand where and when in your supply chain you have US origin technology. You therefore need to understand whether you're meeting, say, the de minimis requirements for US origin content in manufactured goods, or whether you have end users that are in China or connected to these specific 77 entities, or any entity on the entity list for that matter, and really understanding where you've got US origin goods in your supply chain, and be prepared to handle that. Sometimes it's a matter of just pulling that particular widget out of the non-US box and then putting it into the end product that's going to China. In other circumstances, it's much harder to disaggregate the manufacturing process, or there's a particularly unique US component. So you really do need to understand your supply chain and be prepared to make changes or adapt to those changed listings and those changed screening requirements.
So are these controls here to stay? Can we expect a potential reversal under the Biden administration, or can we expect the Biden administration to use, not only keep these the controls in place, but use these controls in a similar manner?
So I would expect that with respect to these 77, the answer is they're here to stay for a bit. The way in which the entity list decisions are made, there's actually an advisory committee that reviews potential additions to the entity list. It's a multi-agency, sort of multifaceted review. And so by the time the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS at Commerce, releases a list like this or makes changes to it, it's gone through a pretty extensive interagency process, and even has had some outside eyes on it from an advisory committee perspective. So those listings are likely to remain in place even under the Biden administration, at least in the short term. Oftentimes, particularly for larger companies that wind up on the entity list, they become, much in the same way that luxury goods become a target and a trading item in the context of a trade dispute between the US and Europe. Those large companies become leverage for other types of concessions or for other types of changes that might be sought in a trade context between the US and China. So they're there to kind of, one, protect US national security, ostensibly. That's the priority reason for doing so. But they can very effectively often serve as leverage for other trade-related disputes that may be on the horizon. So unlike, say, the tariff situation, which was really a function of the Trump administration and really a focal point for the Trump administration's key personnel at USTR, the BIS entity list is much more of an administrative, long-term, more heavily reviewed type of item, and more likely to stick around even in the incoming administration. Thanks,
Mike. These export controls are obviously something that we will all need to be following closely moving forward, specifically as it deals with U.S.-China relations and the U.S. or China and the West relations. That's it for this episode of Trade Notes. Please subscribe to the series to hear more from our experts around the world.
Thanks, Sean.